contribution graphs, then they're directed acyclic graphs. We could think of them as being just, if you think of them in immutable or content addressed sense, you would just have a record, a document, a post, a Git hash, whatever. And, over time, this thing just keeps growing because it's append only with lots of dependencies. But in a lot of graphs that we might construct, we would actually compress this back into a cyclic graph, because as a document goes through its life cycle, it, a piece of code, a blog, whatever, it's going to keep being mutated. And so in the DAG sense, it's a new one with the old one as a dependency. In the sort of cyclic graph sense, it's the same one, but what you've actually done is collapsed those nodes into one node, which is making what the directed acyclic graph into a cyclic graph due to the codependencies between things. It's a neat trick. I'm going to keep moving past that. It's not that I'm suggesting everything needs to be done that way from a computational standpoint. It's a really good mental model because it's old. If you think about authorship of books, for example, you can already start to make one of these DAGs. And if you think about bibliometrics and sort of the history of the sort of science of the contribution graphs vis-a-vis co-authorship and the production of research or such things, you actually get exactly these kinds of graphs. And so it makes sense to reason about co-production in this way, in part because it's sort of persisted through different technologies. It's persisted in the way we behave. And it still boils down to a kind of a contribution graph with a subset of contexts being indexed. So this kind of brings me back to avoiding God's eye measurement systems, which is to say that if we have a rich computational environment with lots of data, then instead of building a God's eye measurement where we say, this is the score, we should be providing tools for people to sort of express preferences over how important particular attributes are and aren't. In some client projects, for example, we've advocated for, collections of KPIs, especially over service providers or operators. Suppose we're talking about something like the Filecoin network and you have storage providers, you might say, make sure that although there's lots of data about the performance of those service providers, you don't release just one metric that says this is the good one, because that will sort of really skew the supply and demand and pricing. Because in reality, there's going to be a variety of attributes. Maybe some service providers have lower quality but lower prices because they just don't spend as much resources. And so there's a different, equilibrium there for a market demand for lower SLAs and lower prices versus higher SLAs and higher prices, or any number of other complex attributes that relate to this much higher dimensional space of effectively a labor economy or a computational labor economy. So moving away from this idea that there's one KPI, at least for an individual service provider or operator, to a family of KPIs where the importance of those various KPIs might vary by context. So I might care a lot more about KPI 1, 2, and 3 and really not give a damn about 4, 5, and 6, but you might be just the opposite. And in fact, if we want price to emerge in a system like that, then you really do need to respect those attributes. And I'll drop a link afterwards. I have another paper on semi-fungibility that relates to this point, but it's a little bit far afield for the talking about sort of reputation and reward systems today. But broadly speaking, it falls in the same family that we might have context-dependent value, but we need to capture data about the attributes that confer that value. So finally, we'll get into the last section on rewards. And so I'm going to talk about this as issuing tokenized rewards, but I don't necessarily mean on-chain tokenized. I just mean that like rewards are tokens, like stickers for your kindergartners are tokens. So in this sense, we're pointing out that it matters not just that you're getting rewards, but it matters how those rewards are distributed. If you give stickers to everyone, or if you give 20 stickers to one person and 1 to everyone else, that's going to affect how people perceive those rewards. It's not just, hey, I got some. It matters the individual allocation, or distribution, as well as the collective quantity. And so if we have a measurement apparatus, we have at least two different kinds of policies that are happening concurrently and in an interrelated way. One is how the measurement at the individual level, or measurements at the individual level, are determining what share of the rewards being issued someone's getting, and another question, which is how many rewards are being given. And so what's tricky about this is that it's effectively an expression of a collective action problem where it's unlikely that everyone will ever totally agree, and part of the reason you use a measurement apparatus is to make it more legitimate and feel more fair because everyone agreed to those rules in advance. The tricky part, though, is that it doesn't necessarily guarantee the desired outcomes. It's a sort of pretty canonical policymaking problem where you set up the rules thinking that you're going to get a particular outcome, and then something else happens. And normally that means revisit the rules you made and ask whether you need to adjust them to drive the desired outcome. But Angela's point at the beginning, you also can't do that too much. So you have to find the right cadence and the right approach to those adjustments. But for starters, we can try to make this feel a little bit fair even when we adjust by introducing a richer measurement apparatus. So if we think of our various data collection mechanisms as sensors, as these KPIs as ways of measuring what's going on, you could say, well, let's start by saying, there's a bunch of different things that we could measure and do measure, and we don't know in advance how important they are going to be. So we could take weights on them, or we could aggregate them using the min or the max, or we could aggregate them by sum, or we can combine some sort of weighted aggregation mechanism with a plurality of metrics. And now a big part of the governance is actually tuning the weights, not necessarily adding and removing new measurements. Or it could be adding and removing new measurements, but otherwise keeping many of them present intact. So, maybe there are 6 measurements and you add a 7th, or maybe there are 6 measurements and you feel like one of them is just not helping and you remove it. These are governance actions over your measurement apparatus, which can be thought of as policymaking. And so at the end of the day, we want to separate out the rules for how much do we mint conditioned on aggregate measurement? What's the distribution conditioned on individual measurement? Okay, what are the sensors that actually capture individual contributions in the collective? Like, do we have a contribution graph? What are we indexing? How are we weighting the things that we're indexing? We start to actually be able to construct a representation which at least feels genuine to the thing being measured, and then basically break it down into machinery that solves those two main questions. How many new tokens or how many new rewards to mint, and how should they be distributed? With a reminder that this is going to be an ongoing game, right? This isn't a one-shot. So if it doesn't feel fair, part of the game is changing the game. If the purpose of the group is not being met, then this is the apparatus to go to and adjust to try to steer. And so you need to have enough flexibility that people can go back and adapt it, but enough rigidity that people trust it. And that was the gist of this drawing, actually, in one of the short source code articles I wrote on network formation games. It basically talks about the decisions of the individual contributors as strategic actions and the decisions of the maintainers, where at that time, we were discussing the maintainers as being sort of responsible for selecting the various weights, some of these algorithmic policy-making activities. Now, I think in practice, we've moved and continue to move in a direction which is more like this governance as multi-scale adaptation. This is actually from the original social sensor fusion short paper / proposal that gave rise to conviction voting. And I don't know if people know this, but conviction voting was originally intended for continuous parametered variables, and that we shifted in a direction of focusing on passing proposals using trigger functions, because that was particularly what was needed in the sort of common stack one hive research cases. But the function was to sense the misalignment or alignment between some parameters in a measurement system or some parameters in a decision-making system and allow people to propose those changes and to adapt those values over time by basically merging preferences. And the key aspect to this drawing is actually in this lower loop, you see stuff happens in the world, people observe or experience outcomes, and they have their own perceptions of it. And if they don't feel as though it's representative, they can express a preference into a system that can actually mutate those rules. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you need to use conviction voting for this, but the idea is that this process should take place. There should be a means of looking at the measurement apparatus, the choice of KPIs, the weights of those KPIs, the aggregations, the way in which you index activities and attribute them to individuals versus attribute them to the group, all have to be part of this policy constellation that ultimately steers your organization. And so that difficulty is that that's hard, even in a centralized setting, right? If I'm a executive and I have a team and I'm responsible for, say, looking at both the company's progress towards its stated goal and for assessing the untangling of the contributions of the individuals in order to reward and compensate them, I'm already solving what is effectively an untenable problem. There isn't an absolute objective answer. There is a lens through which I interpret the individual activities as some complex graph web thing, and that somehow that collection of activities that's interdependent gave rise to that, group level outcome. And so any attempt to decompose the collective outcome into individual contributions is going to be subjective, and therefore it is going to be an act of policymaking. And the trick here is to just get over that and then work together to come up with something that works, including a process for adapting that thing. Which brings me to my last slide, which is